All right, thanks to everybody for sticking around for our last panel, the politics of food policy. As I said, this is in a way, the most important, right? Because we're not going to get anything done without getting our hands dirty in politics a little bit. So I'm especially grateful to our moderator, Colin O'Neill, for this next panel, who is a veteran on the Hill and well-equipped to guide us through this discussion and stepped in on short notice. He is the Senior Director of Public Policy and Social Impact of the vertical farming company Bowery. But before that, I had the privilege of working with Colin when he was at EWG, and he's a great advocate and skilled Capitol Hill swamp thing.
Swamp creature? I prefer swamp creature.
So I'll turn it over to him. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Thomas. Appreciate that. And thank you all for staying. I think first I wanted to say thank you to that last panel. I hope some of the advocates in the room are already thinking about a football coach, NFL player lobby day. I feel like that would be really great. I'm sure the NFL players keep in touch with their high school coaches. Just saying. Anyways, really excited to be here today and really excited to join this esteemed panel to talk about the politics of food. I'm sure many of us in this room wake up every morning checking Politico and Jerry Hagstrom's report and lots of other folks to keep their finger on the pulse of food politics in addition to food policy. I certainly do it right before I go to get my toddlers, and so I'm really excited to be here with these great panelists. I'll introduce them. Abby Liebman, she's president and CEO of Mazon, a Jewish response to hunger. We've got Aliyah Ned, director of government relations for the National Cooperative Business Association. Ricardo Salvador, director and senior scientist for the Food and Environment Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. And Jonathan Voss, partner at Lake Research Partners, a progressive polling firm. So I'm going to keep this conversation flowing. If I interrupt you, just know that we've got a lot of ground to cover, and I'm really excited and want to make sure that you, the audience, can capture not just what voters are thinking. Obviously, voters are a really important demographic this election year, but also the how, the why, and what some of our advocates and policy wonks are thinking about doing on Capitol Hill and across the country. So with that, let's dive right in. I'm going to try and ground some of these themes with starting with Jonathan in particular to understand what the polling data tell us about how consumers are feeling, consumer sentiment, and what the voters are going to be thinking this November. So first, I'd like to start with food prices. Obviously, as a consumer and working for a produce company, I can tell you that inflation impacts everyone across the value chain, both consumers, food businesses alike. Consumers are obviously worried about food prices. Jonathan, how much do you think so-called foodflation is going to impact the choices that voters make in November? Who are they blaming, and where do food prices stack up in the list of consumer concerns about food?
Certainly, thank you. First of all, thank you for having this and for having me as part of this panel. Inflation writ large is going to be a tremendously dominant theme throughout this election. It already has been. I feel very fortunate that I'm a person who is able to put food on the table and not have to think twice about the price. But for a lot of people, the price really does matter, and it's an acutely felt thing repetitively. You're constantly putting food on the table, constantly struggling. And so inflation, and that it's most emotionally compelling around things like food, like gas, which is obviously something people need to be able to get to work. And because it's emotionally compelling, it can be very politically powerful. I'm sure some of you have heard of the $18 Big Mac that conservative media has loved to turn into a meme in their attempts to blame Biden for inflation and foodflation in particular. It's an isolated thing, but it's something that is very emotionally compelling and evocative and therefore can be viral and therefore can be used politically. But notwithstanding the political power of things like that, it's a legitimate concern. Gallup in August asked about food concerns, and 81% of voters said that the cost of food was their top concern. People could choose 5. Second was the healthiness of food in their diet. Third was at 34% food waste. But when you dive into people about food waste, what motivates you to reduce food waste? 82% to save money, by far and away the top reason to conserve food. That clearly is like an environmental and a climate component to food waste, et cetera, but for real people, it's about saving money. The second highest motivation for reducing food waste was to manage their home more efficiently. So there are many concerns around food, but right now cost is far and away number one. Inflation in general, I think, is going to be a key battle of concern. And in terms of who voters blame, it depends really on the media diet, no pun intended, that they consume at the moment. For the right, it's overwhelmingly Biden's fault, right? They have created that narrative that this is all about Biden, even though inflation is a global phenomenon at the moment, and I recognize that it's very complex. The $18 Big Mac, hashtag Biden's America, right? It fits within a narrative, and there's a concerted effort to fit this within a narrative. On the right, on the left, excuse me, I can't believe I just said that. On the left, we are a progressive polling firm. I'm one of many voices that have been suggesting that we need to proactively situate this within a more corporate greed frame, and price gouging, which is something that we have tested in various different contexts without inflation, and voters do blame that. They recognize that there are corporations who've gone on record about how their earnings have been buttressed by the inflationary environment. But I would say that on the right, there's a concerted effort to create a narrative to blame this administration. On the left, it's a little bit more diffuse. And so I think who voters blame really is a function of the media environment and the media consumption they have. But I want to turn it over to the rest of the panel. Price and foodflation, inflation in general, very politically powerful, very charged. And while there is a manufactured narrative around it, the effect is real. And when we talk to people in focus groups, they are struggling, and it is very top of mind.
Thank you. So I think really helpful to ground the conversation. Aaliyah, I'd love to turn to you to ask, what role you see for co-ops, if any, in helping to lower food prices for consumers.
Yeah, and that's a great question, and I think folks in the room might also have the question, what are co-ops doing in the mix here? And co-ops have a distinctly large presence throughout our economy, with 1 in 3 Americans being at least a member of one cooperative, and there are 65,000 across the country. Now, this includes your consumer cooperatives within the credit union space or food co-op space, agriculture, rural electrics, and even employee-owned businesses that provide goods and services to consumers. Co-ops, as a business, to level set the conversation, they are democratically owned and governed businesses by the members within a community. They are principles-based, and they were originally formed to fulfill a community need. And based on the points that Jonathan made here, and the conversation that's going on at the national level, the concern with voters, we would say that this is currently a community need to address inflation prices. And we know that also co-ops are nonpartisan. They are existing and touch every sector of our economy. And this is demonstrated even up on the Hill, where things seem quite contentious, through the Bipartisan Cooperative Business Caucus, where members on both sides of the aisle come together to use co-ops as a creative solution for our time. So to the question that you posed, Colin, as democratically owned and governed business that are rooted in principles, one of these principles is concern for community. And this makes them nimble and more responsive to the need, and they aren't new. As I mentioned, agriculture cooperatives, consumer cooperatives, rural electrics have been bolstered by a national policy environment. And most recently, this dates back to the 1800s when they were first formed, to the 1930s to power rural homes, and to the pandemic to address supply chain shortages. Everything was shut down, and food co-ops and the cooperative community writ large came together to fill those gaps. So turning to the food space, we know that they can shorten the supply chain, where 21% of the goods sold in cooperatives across the country are sourced from local producers. And there is an interplay within those other sectors of the consumer cooperative movement, with credit unions being lenders to consumer and retail food co-ops, supporting producer co-ops through small business assistance, and through their democratic governance structure, they can come together and say, hey, maybe we need to adjust here in terms of the pay that we're giving to ourselves as the employee owners of the business to better benefit our consumers. And sometimes these can come together in a multi-stakeholder cooperative environment where consumers and workers are then the community owners of the business. So the long story short is folks in the community know what they need. No one wants to deal with high prices for things. And so folks can come together to say, hey, let's address this issue in a creative way.
That's great. Thank you. And something tells me this might not be the last time we talk about ownership structures. But Ricardo, I'd love to turn to you. Are there other factors that you see that may be contributing to rising food prices? And are there warning signs we should have addressed prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, which has obviously amplified things?
Yeah, we do need to deal with the factor that you've already raised, Jonathan, which is where food prices come from and understand whether that's a fair process or not. But to your question about other factors that we need to consider, there are two considerations when you're talking about affordability, and obviously we focus on cost of the article that we're focused on. It can be a little bit of a red herring because it makes us forget that the other side of that equation is, of course, what we earn. That's the other part of affordability. You all are experts. You all are quite familiar with the figure that the Economic Research Service from USDA tracks that tells us that currently people in this country spend about 11% of their disposable income on food. 6% of that roughly is what we eat at home. And that is a very misconstrued figure because affordability is not equal to absolute cost. The cost of food in the United States is among the highest that there is on the planet. So it's not quite the brag that we think that it is when we cite that figure. What we're really bragging about is how wealthy we are, the third nation in terms of median household income after only Luxembourg and the United Arab Emirates, very small countries. So we're very, very wealthy. That's what the brag is about. The question that we need to be focusing on here is a little bit different, and I'll illustrate it for you by using another ERS analysis from that same food tracking study. So food prices have been rising ever since USDA has been tracking them way back in the 1920s. And in one of their analyses, which they update periodically, they divide our population up into quintiles by income. And of course, as you would predict, the wealthier we become, the more we spend on food, but the smaller a proportion of our disposable income that is. If you focus on the lowest quintile, 67 million in our population, they spend about 31% of their income on food. That's not typically what you think of occurring in the United States, a third of your disposable income on food. They're living in a completely different reality and experience than the brag would indicate when we repeat it mindlessly. Just so that you put that into context, if you rank the nations of the world in terms of that particular indicator, if that 67 million people were a country of their own, they would slot right in between Russia and Egypt, just so that you have a visual for what that means. Embedded in our country, that is the reality. So the question really becomes, how is it that we live in a nation where people are not earning sufficiently to be able to cover a basic necessity for our existence? And so, of course, that leads us to an area that most of us wouldn't think of when we think we're talking about food policy, and that is our wage policies across the nation. And it becomes even more ironic when you ask, who are these people? ERS has just issued another study where they're answering that question. What is the nature of the structure of hunger in this nation? It will come up in later discussions in this panel, I hope, that it is no coincidence that those that experience the highest rates of hunger in the United States are the Native American population, rates of hunger that are around 28%. The reasons to a group like this probably are self-evident, but there was a distinct policy that was waged over about 50 years to dispossess them of their land, their livelihood, and make them completely dependent for their food as a way of essentially conquering them. That policy was successful, and the outcome is that they experienced some of the worst food outcomes on the planet, not just on this nation, in terms of hunger, diabetes, obesity, and so on. So these are very explicit things that we've made deliberate choices about. So there's one of the things that we should be talking about when we think that we're talking about price of food. Now, when I mentioned that we need to come back to the point about price gouging that you've raised, Jonathan, let me just call your attention so that we don't lose sight of it, that publicly held companies are expected to give public reports of their finances, and if you track what these companies are saying to their stockholders in these quarterly meetings, dating back to the beginning of the pandemic, they are there stating openly that an inflationary environment is very good for their business because of the fact that they can take prices. And so, this goes all the way from processors to retailers bragging about this. The very specifics that they'll explain to their stockholders are that the sweet spot is around a 3 to 4% inflation rate. So just to situate that, before the pandemic, inflation had settled for about 4 years at around a 2% level. It rose to a high of 7% during the pandemic. Currently, we've come down to a level of about 3%. The sweet spot is 3 to 4% because as long as many factors are driving the prices of food up, retailers have discovered that we will take it. We will accept that prices are high and pay the prices that they're asking. If you go above that level, then we do start make choices. We'll buy a little bit less of luxury food items and so on. So that's the sweet spots for them, and they brag about that. They'll tell you directly that they're taking prices as much as the market will bear.
Thank you, Ricardo. Keeping on the topic of, I think, flexibility and consumers that have either more or less flexibility, Abby, when I think about rising food prices, I have to think about food insecure households being, hardest hit. SNAP benefits are adjusted for inflation. Would love for you to dig into that. But, plenty of people who struggle with food insecurity are also not eligible for SNAP. There's a gap. And, Mazone does tremendous work to address those underserved populations that may be falling through the cracks. How severe is the problem and what should be done for them?
Wow. Okay. So let me explain how Mazone approaches its work. So Mazone, a Jewish Response to Hunger, is a national advocacy organization, and our work is to end hunger in the United States and Israel for all people, for people of all faiths and backgrounds, but we are guided by Jewish values, which will come up as I speak. The way in which we have approached our work in the past decade is to look at some of the populations that struggle with hunger in America who may be going unaddressed or underaddressed by other advocates. For us, this means that they have some unique needs that need unique approaches that the one-size-fits-all that our current nutrition safety net looks like may not be effective for them. Nor, when we look at the causes of hunger, are they uniform across all communities. So right now, among our priorities are looking at tribal nations. We look at the concerns of single mothers, currently serving military families, also veterans, which are two very separate communities and have very different drivers of their food insecurity. Seniors, particularly LGBT seniors, and then Puerto Rico and the other territories. So these are places where we see significant levels of food insecurity. And while I agree that there are those who are not eligible for SNAP, which I will get to, our National Nutrition Safety Net is an amazing system. It is limited, yes. It is underfunded, yes. And it is misunderstood, way yes. But right now, the average benefit for those in a family of 4 in the United States on SNAP is about $700 a month. So when we think about what food costs, and we can all do this kind of math, no one is getting rich on SNAP. Typically, people's benefits run out by the last week of the month. So they are then left to really struggle. And we'll talk later, I know, about issues about healthier food choices, et cetera, but much of these things are driven by the financial reality of what it is like to have to be on food benefits. We also have tremendous mythology about who needs this kind of support in this country. I don't think this is a surprise to anybody in this room, that people who are on SNAP typically are working. They are just paid inadequately to support themselves and their families. And when we think about what we embrace as Jewish values, and we think about the notions of dignity and self-respect and the lack of judgment about why you are in the circumstances in which you are. Our teachings tell us that that's not our job, that our job is to respond to when there is need without judgment and to hold all people with dignity. So what does that mean? It means for us in this space that we are working to make these programs far more universally available and to make them as broad and as deep as they need to be and as specific as they can be. So what happens to those people who don't qualify for SNAP, including people who are undocumented immigrants in this country who are not, is that they rely on the charitable food sector. And the charitable food sector is incredibly limited in its reach. That it is not an answer. It is not anywhere equivalent to the size and scope of what the federal government does do and could do. And these programs are expensive. Why? Because there are almost 40 million people that are on SNAP in this country. And there are over 40 million people who are food insecure. So we are looking at a huge and significant part of our population. So that when we think about what it would cost to provide them with this level of support, which they typically don't need for more than a few months, however, during the pandemic, there were some exceptions. We look at how we could provide a support system that is really an integrated support that recognizes the realities of people's lives and what their needs are. This country almost ended hunger at one point in its history. Mazone has a virtual hunger museum that tells the story of hunger in America from about the Gilded Age to now and what our government's response to it was. When the Great Society programs and the War on Poverty were launched in the 1960s up to the 70s, what we saw was hunger get reduced to about 3% in the United States. It's currently about 12% of our population. That is an enormous response. Why? Because these programs were working in coordination to address what was really going on in terms of people's wages and support systems and what they needed in their lives. So we have the ability, we just lack, apropos of this panel, the political will to do what needs to be done. And that's where advocates like us come in. This is why we serve this really vital role in this entire ecosystem of response to hunger in this country. Without that kind of pressure, the information, the underscoring of what is possible, we will remain stuck in a terrible place that's devastating for millions of people that we know and those that we don't know, all of whom deserve to be stable and secure in their ability to feed themselves and their families.
You mentioned public perception and often misunderstood perception among many people about anti-hunger programs, anti-poverty programs. Jonathan, I'd love for you to chime in here. What do voters think about SNAP and anti-hunger programs today? Is there a split by party affiliation, or what are we, and what can we expect this November about how much this might influence their decisions?
Certainly. I think one of the things that sometimes gets lost is actually how much voters agree on some of this. We asked in 2022 in a survey around safety net programs how favorable a view you have towards SNAP. We asked it branded SNAP. We asked it as, in parentheses, food stamps. We found 75% of Americans have a favorable impression of SNAP, 83% of Democrats and 65% of Republicans. So a bipartisan majority view SNAP favorably. And I definitely think that the pandemic has shifted attitudes towards SNAP. I think there are a lot of people who had no interaction with the program who all of a sudden did. Just tremendous imagery of people waiting online for food banks. And so just a much larger attention given to hunger in general. However, underneath that veneer of favorability towards SNAP, there is lingering structural and intentional political strategy to denigrate SNAP and SNAP recipients. You mentioned that we got to 3% hunger in the 70s, and then you get Reagan in the 80s talking about welfare queens and denigrating people on welfare. And we did focus groups in 2011, and I distinctly remember, because I moderated both of these, one in New Hampshire, independent white men in New Hampshire, one independent white men in Charlotte, North Carolina, and you heard the same exact anecdote. And I don't want to accuse people of lying in a focus group. However, when you hear people say, I'm online and the person in front of me is using their food stamps to buy a steak, and then they go out to their Cadillac with 18-inch rims. I remember searching the transcripts for the word Cadillac, and it came out in both. I was like, I've heard this exact same story. And there has been an intentional weaponization of these programs for decades to turn people away from government, to blame the other, to divide and conquer. And I think it's important to note as we head towards this election that ground is shifting a little bit. It used to be very explicitly anti-black, and we're seeing anti-immigrant now. You're seeing a lot of memes online of people saying, we're giving these people who have been bused to New York City free hotel rooms and free food and food stamps. What about us? What about everyone else who's starving? And there's a real conversation having gasoline poured on it to point the finger at people who are moving to this country, picking up and trying to seek asylum and get a better life. And so, yes, majorities favor SNAP. Yes, majorities favor, believe it or not, the social safety net. But that does not take away some of the political power that is being used and exploited by one faction of a political party for their own political gain at the moment. And I don't want to lose sight of that.
Thank you. Keeping with SNAP, and I know some of us were in the breakout session this morning around obesity and how to tackle diet-related disease. Lightning rod question, but some might suggest that self-checkout lines make it easier than ever to restrict SNAP. Others obviously want to protect and expand SNAP as a critical anti-hunger and anti-poverty program. Is there a world where Democrats would ever support restricting SNAP?
No. Yes and no. There are Democrats who actually support, I don't want that world. The world exists, yes, of course. Surprised we did have this conversation before. That there are Democrats who do support restricting SNAP. The approach to trying to ensure that people who are struggling with food insecurity also have access to healthy food I think that's a really vitally important goal. And I don't think there's anybody that would dispute that. We do not support restrictions on SNAP. We certainly support incentive programs, of which there are many in this country, where you give individuals on SNAP additional funds if they purchase healthier food options, fruits and vegetables, lean cuts of meat, whole grains, et cetera. But again, these are rational financial choices by people who are struggling. That if you walk into the grocery store and a box of mac and cheese is on special for 99 cents and the ingredients to buy a salad are $6, the salad goes for one meal and then the produce may or may not stretch for multiple meals. That box of mac and cheese can feed a whole family and maybe for the next night. It's a rational choice. Food is very expensive. So when the USDA recently updated the Thrifty Food Plan, it was a revolution in the way in which people could be able to purchase food. Now, the Thrifty Food Plan is used to determine what the SNAP benefits would be. There's a review of what kinds of food consumers are purchasing and what it would cost. And that plan has certain specific foods and food groups in it. It had not been updated for decades, literally decades. And under the leadership at USDA now, they did update it. And acting well within their authority, they did this. And what that has meant is that the benefits increased because the cost of healthier food options is typically much higher, not just higher, much higher than other forms of sustenance, we'll call it, right? So I think there's a strong desire, and in the incentive programs, when they are used, people use them. But what happens is, again, end of the month, they've run out of benefit. So what does that mean? They don't have they have food that will not last till the end of the month because fresh food spoils. If it's not used, it's going to spoil. And again, there was reference to food waste earlier, Jonathan, that they're not wasting their food either. So at the end of the month, they're going to start purchasing things that have preservatives in them, that are going to last, that have stable, longer shelf lives. But the desire is there. It's just, those Jewish values for us tell us we treat people with dignity. We do not question whether or not they should be treated as we are. There is an obesity epidemic in the United States. There are 86 million people that struggle with obesity and the related diseases. And even if every single person on SNAP was obese, which is not the case, they would still not be the majority of the people who are struggling with obesity. So experimenting on poor people is something, again, that is anathema to our Jewish values. And that we all have to take some responsibility here and think through what works for this nation among all consumers and not just those who are struggling.
Thank you. And bringing in the Farm Bill into this conversation with SNAP, obviously SNAP, overwhelming majority of Farm Bill spending and therefore takes up a majority of Farm Bill airtime up on Capitol Hill. Aaliyah, I'd love your perspective about, there are other portions of the Farm Bill, other titles that have tremendous benefit to consumers. Do you think this constant horse trading over SNAP and SNAP policy, risks any inclusion of positive reforms? Does that sucking up airtime risk attention from, positive benefits that we could see for consumers or food policy?
And it spends a lot of airtime, the Farm Bill that is, up on Congress, and a lot of my time as Director of Government Relations at the National Cooperative Business Association is spent up on Capitol Hill talking about other titles, the many, many other titles that are encompassed within the Farm Bill. For us, as a member trade association representing co-ops across all sectors, including the ones I mentioned, like our farmer co-ops, our rural electrics, our food co-ops, our cooperative lenders within our farm credit system, our membership is vast. And you can only imagine the many, many different areas of policy that we touch on and focus on and work with our partners on. But to put it plainly as we hear it and as we've heard it, and there's been a bit of a clarion cry, a strong nutrition title supports producers, full stop. With the finger pointing and contextualizing it to the co-op community, as I mentioned, food co-ops source their goods from local producers, and 98% of food cooperatives, often located in our rural areas, low income, low access areas, which tend to be rural, 98% of these food co-ops are SNAP retailers. And for every dollar that is spent at a food cooperative, $1.6 are recirculated into the local economy. So coming back to the context of the Farm Bill, particularly with rural development, and hearing the benefits and the many sectors of the economy that it touches, there's one federal program out of 1900 to support co-op development, to help folks transition their businesses, to create this model that empowers not only local people through that reinvestment in local economies, but also workers by paying higher wages, whether you're a member owner as a consumer or not. And these other titles can help support this work. The Rural Cooperative Development Grant is a key priority for us, and one key way that I spend a lot of my time talking about, and it's housed within the Farm Bill. A lot of other initiatives, like the Healthy Food Financing Initiative, that allows food retailers to support SNAP beneficiaries and other development sources, are in the Rural Development title. Business and industry loan guarantees are in the Rural Development title. So robust economic development, energy transition is in the Farm Bill. And so a lot of time is spent trying to, pit sides against each other or finger pointing, as Jonathan pointed out. But there is a robust conversation to be had outside of the nutrition title, which again, really supports producers who, I think, is sometimes when the finger pointing happens. But we have to have a strong farm bill across the board to make sure that communities can really thrive, and we're talking about what people matter. Because again, the statistics are staggering how many people on the ground actually support these key programs. And we're missing out on good work that can be done through capacity building initiatives, through, again, supporting co-op development and economic development writ large, access to broadband, which is of key critical importance that is needed to then have economic development and improved community access to food. So all of these things are swept up in the conversation, and I think we need to really sort of shift our mindset in the way that it's talked about as it matters to voters on the ground.
Thank you. And Farm Bill, I think for many, you see it as kind of the baseline of food policy. Obviously, there's a food policy conference. Ricardo, do we have a national food policy? And if not, why not? And what would it take?
There is no national food policy, and if you ask somebody who doesn't know planet Earth, say just landed from Mars, to observe the decisions that we make that affect the nation's food system, all the way from production to access to food, after some careful observation, they would have to conclude that the implicit food policy, there is no stated national food policy, but the implicit food policy, as evidenced by the choices that we make, the investments that we make, the interests that we prioritize, would be something like exploit people and nature for agribusiness profit. That's what our policies add up to. Now, I don't want you to hear that as saying the interests of agribusiness are not important. The important thing to note is that they have such influence on national food policy that it's if they were the citizens of this nation and the rest of us just lived in it. It's their interest that because of their economic and political power, they're able to translate into, it sounds like a joke, being able to write the rules that benefit themselves. So something that would be better than that would be simple as well, another one-liner, food, health, and well-being for all. And in that simple statement, we obviously name that, of course, food influences our health. We should recognize that as a scientific finding and not just allow companies to decide to sell the most profitable ultra-processed food because it's good for their bottom line and claim that they're feeding people when, in fact, they're poisoning people. There is a role of oversight for that particular type of behavior that doesn't exist at the moment that would be the domain of public policy acting in the common interest. Talking about well-being of everyone would address the fact that we should not condone a system whereby we do not allow common labor protections that all of us assume we all have in white-collar work to apply to folks that perform some of the most difficult labor that there is in this nation, which is the labor of planting, processing, gathering, distributing our food. As you know, because of peculiarities of actually getting the New Deal programs passed, there were compromises that the Roosevelt administration made to get white Southern votes that allowed them to actually exclude field laborers from benefiting in labor protections, collective bargaining, and other things that all of us take for granted. That should not be a part of a food system, or at least not one that we're proud of, and yet it is at this moment. And when we add the corollary for all, it means the food system should not be good just for some people. We've all been talking about the fact that the food system and the policies that sustain it are not good for everyone in this nation. So if we had a food policy to aim for, I would submit that that would be it. There are layers to this question, obviously. We have addressed several of us in comments during this panel that food prices, which is usually the way that we evaluate the goodness of the system, are complicated. They have lots of different drivers. One of the questions that we should all explore is whether the food system that we have at the moment actually is addressed by policy as a system, by the standard engineering definition of multiple parts working in coordination to deliver a stated end. And you will discover that we have fragmentary policy in lots of different domains that is formulated completely independently of the effects that it will have on other parts of the food system. Yet we keep talking as if we were managing the system through policy. Well, some of the examples that we've talked about here already are wage policy, whereby we allow some folks in this country, and actually expect some folks in this country because it's good for business interests, to earn insufficient amounts for them to pay the cost of food. Because that one of the things that we haven't stated is that food is expensive for a reason. There are a lot of costs that need to be covered. And you need to be able to earn sufficient amounts to be able to pay for that. So that should be part of a food policy, even though we regard it as something that's in a completely different domain. I'll give you just one other example. Our nation's immigration policy is most definitely a part of our food policy, and yet most of us don't regard it that way. In modern economics, we allow articles to go across borders, manufacturers, products, and so on. That's different from the mercantile economy that used to prevail. In our modern world, we wouldn't imagine the economy functioning without allowing capital to go across borders, but we impose barriers toward labor going across borders in response to supply and demand. So because the labor that is required for the entire food system to work across the entire value chain is labor that demonstrably folks born in this country don't deign themselves worthy of doing and will not perform at any price, there is demand for people to come and do that work, who have the skills and the will to do that work. And immigration policy is the way that we cudgel them to accept below dignity wages, below dignity working conditions. And again, that should not be the case in a 21st century food system. So those are examples of fragmentary policies that add up to a system that is not working, is exploitative, consumptive, degradative,
Thank you.
and can improve.
All right, we're getting political here. So keeping on the theme of fragmented, Jonathan, Congress obviously appears to be one of, if not the most dysfunctional Congresses in our country's history. I think many in this room are glad to see, the FDA putting the F back in FDA and making sure that's front and center in policy. We're seeing progress by the Biden administration, but, states are not waiting for the Biden administration or other agencies to act. And we've seen states move to, ban toxic chemicals in food, address animal welfare. What's the big driver at the state level? Is it partisan at the state level where we're seeing that? Or is this a nonpartisan kind of reflective of that populist support for food policy that you mentioned earlier?
Sure. I think one of the things to note, though, is it depends on which state, right? We have 23 states with Republican trifectas. So that means the Republicans, the governor, Republican majority in both houses of the state legislative branch. 17 states are Democratic trifectas, and 10 states are split with divided government. And so I think you're probably going to get, and I am not the policy expert here, but you're probably going to get a vastly different set of policies from Republican trifecta states than you are from Democratic trifecta states. Part of that is politics. Part of that is the nature of the state, right? I think California is going to have a much different policy environment than Nebraska, a much different need for and movement behind worker protections, et cetera. But I think, so yes, you have different states that are going to produce different results, and if to the extent that that is the laboratory of democracy, the balance of power here in DC ultimately matters in terms of what gets adopted. But one of the things that I think is just important to differentiate is between differences of policymakers based on their partisan stripes and the differences among voters. If you just listen to policymakers talk, we really are living in two different worlds, right? Democrats and Republicans cannot agree on anything. But when you listen to voters, there's actually a tremendous amount of agreement. And so it's really voters are ahead of their elected leaders. And that's not just a food thing. That is really consistent across many different issues, whether it be climate or other issues that I won't belabor here. But I think that it's important to keep that in mind, that voters are more in line. Yes, you see 83 versus 65% favorability among SNAP, amongst registered voters by party lines. But you're going to see a much different thing when it comes to the members of Congress who talk on cable news and what those numbers reflect. But I think just as we think about what bubbles up from the states, you're just two vastly different worlds when it comes to a Republican trifecta state that's going to be informed by those Republican policymakers, even though there might be more alignment amongst their voters versus Democratic trifecta states.
Thank you. And you're right. There are, I mean, think about Florida and its recent actions on cell-cultured meat, and there are lots of examples where states are looking to use their laboratory in ways that are probably counter to what most consumers are asking for. Ricardo, Secretary Vilsack has said that the state-by-state approach to address issues like animal welfare will create chaos. Is he right? Is he wrong? And what should states be focusing on next?
So I think that's a reference to Proposition 12 from California in particular. That depends whose interests you're prioritizing, because again, with the very nice context that you just provided us, if you believe in consumer choice, then the action in California is consumers stating what they prefer in terms of the conditions under which hogs are going to be raised. And if that old business aphorism of the customer is king actually were believed, then that's what the industry should satisfy. There's demand for humanely raised pork. That's what the industry should deliver. The so-called chaos, the claim of chaos, has to do with the fact that to produce pork at very large scale in models that were developed in the Midwest, you are not able to satisfy the standards that were set by the state of California. And producers, therefore, are saying in so many words, that's not fair because you're asking us to do things that are going to be difficult for us to do. Whereas, in fact, I've just stated the case that comes out of, business mythology that they actually ought to compete for satisfying the demand that exists there. So to your question, yes, of course, you could say it would create chaos, although the word that I would use or the way that I would describe it is adjusting the value chain to meet consumer demand. But the industry could say that it's going to create chaos because of the fact that then they're driven by consumers to change their methods of production. So when you say that you don't want that chaos to occur, and you're taking the viewpoint of the industry, not the viewpoint of the eaters. Mm-hmm. So, but as you stated, that's one particular example, and it's very difficult to generalize on the general principle other than to say that it is important for federal policy to reflect where the population is. Mm-hmm. And that very seldom actually occurs.
All right, on the note of federal policy, obviously Farm Bill top of mind for everyone here. I wake up every morning and think about the Farm Bill. Which,
it's actually sad.
Yeah, it is sad. My wife gives me a lot of gripe for that. I should be making the kids lunches instead of worrying about the Farm Bill. So we've got 2 minutes. I would love to ask the panelists, are we going to have a Farm Bill this year? If so, when? And if not, why? And who's to blame? In 2 minutes or less. Abby, let's start with you.
So the answer is yes, because Congressman Thompson is going to introduce a farm bill before the end of April and expects it to move. I'm not sure that's going to actually happen. I'm not sure what the Senate side is going to do. I think there's some talk about Bozeman is going to introduce one on the Senate side. The House version will be a non-starter because it will be packed with all kinds of highly partisan political nonsense that have nothing to do with the titles in the Farm Bill, comprehensive as they are. So will we have a real Farm Bill? I'm not saying when that will happen, but we will have partisan battles around it.
Partisan farm bills. Okay, Aaliyah, a lot of senators, Sherrod Brown, John Tester, obviously making Farm Bill part of their reelection campaigns. Will we have a Farm Bill?
We hope so from this side. I think the challenge will be working through some of the tough points as the cooperative community, given all of the titles that are critically important to our members, our folks, and our nation writ large. It's important that we have a farm bill, but one that is comprehensive, meets the needs of folks on the ground, and for us, rooted in the cooperative principles, demonstrates a concern for our national community because everyone works together across the lines. If we can come together as a co-op ecosystem, we have hope that given co-ops are a nonpartisan business structure with bipartisan support from both members of Congress, that will bleed into folks' desires, or as things get to move, that support for the Farm Bill and getting it done and getting it right.
All right, Ricardo, 30 seconds or less.
We're not going to have a farm bill, and I actually think we may have seen the last pro forma farm bill ever. And the rationale for that is that one of the many issues that we're stuck on is that the commodity and production world is looking for $50 billion for a very specific program on the claim that they expect that there's going to be bad times, bad economic times ahead, and they want to protect their bottom line. And they see as the banks money for nutrition programs or money from IRA for conservation programs. And in doing that and being steadfastly obdurate about that, they've alienated just about everyone. And so the bet is, can they push that through without the traditional partnership that dates to 85 from the conservation groups and to 73 from the nutrition groups? And my bet would be the nutrition groups probably have the politics behind them to operate without that coalition, but not the commodity groups. Hedging that, if there is a farm bill, I don't think Congress has the time to push it through. It's one factor against. I don't think they have the skills to negotiate a bipartisan bill, not this particular Congress. And so if there is a farm bill, my hedge is they'll basically figure out a way to quickly, with very little thought, essentially continue the 18 farm bill. But I don't even expect that.
All right, Jonathan, last but not least, I mentioned the reelection campaigns from Senator Tester, Chair Brown. Ranking member Senator Bozeman said it doesn't get any easier next Congress if we push it to next Congress. Will we have a farm bill? I know you're not the farm bill expert, but and will it be easier for Congress to work together next year, or is Senator Bozeman right?
I don't know why you want to close this question on me. I am not the Hill Watcher. I honestly don't know. I'm not going to pretend to know. I will say this, though. Though there is this appearance of dysfunction, there have been moments where this Congress has been able to pass some things meaningfully, not necessarily perfection, but so I hold out some hope, but I refuse to be the authority on that. That is not me. That is you all.
Well, that's great. Thank you. Thank you for closing us out, Jonathan. Thanks to all our panel.
All right. Great panel. Thanks. Yeah, I wish we could have you guys up